Hello, Modern World History students. We're continuing with unit number 7, The Rise of Totalitarian Dictators, and we're also continuing with section number 5. We started section number 5 in a previous lesson, but we didn't get to finish it, so now we'll continue it. And we're actually continuing this explanation right here, how Lenin and the Bolsheviks dealt with internal threats facing Soviet Russia. Previously, we talked about how Lenin and the Bolsheviks decided that Tsar Nicholas II and his family were going to have to die because as long as they were alive, they held out hope for the Tsarists of restoring them to power. So we talked about the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and the family. We also talked about the Red Terror carried out by Lenin's secret police, the Cheka, in which they targeted people really just for who they were, not for what they had done. They targeted leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church and monks and priests of the church. They targeted nobles. Regardless of whether these church leaders or nobles had done anything to harm the Russian people, they were regarded as enemies of the Russian people simply for who they were. And so hundreds of thousands of them were murdered because they were considered to be an enemy or threat to the Russian people and to Lenin's power. But the greatest threat to Lenin's power came in the form of the Russian Civil War. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk about how Leon Trotsky's Red Army won it for the Bolsheviks and helped to preserve Lenin in power. Finally, I hope you'll be able to explain how the Soviet Union was formed, which was officially called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But I grew up calling it the Soviet Union, or USSR. So we'll cover all that in the first part of our lesson here. So let's go ahead and get started. And I'm back on page number 9. And since we're on page number 9, we're gonna be at the lower right-hand corner to talk about the Russian Civil War. So the Russian Civil War was fought between the Reds and the Whites. So, think about how in our Civil War, colors were also associated with the two sides, right? There was the blue and the gray. The blue were the soldiers of the Union fighting to preserve the United States. The gray were the soldiers of the Confederacy. Well, in the Russian Civil War, it was the Reds versus the Whites. The Reds were those supporting Lenin and the Bolsheviks, right? Red was their color. And so the Reds, during the Russian Civil War, were supporting Lenin and the Bolsheviks, preserving the new communist dictatorship. The Whites were everybody else. The Whites were all of the other people fighting in the Civil War. And that included both Mensheviks, people who wanted to bring back the provisional government, and Tsarists, people who wanted to bring back the monarchy. And that brings up a really important point about the Whites. Remember that the Bolsheviks regarded the Mensheviks and the Tsarists as essentially all on the same team. That's why they lumped them together and simply referred to them as Whites. But they weren't on the same team. The Whites who wanted to bring back the provisional government obviously had very different goals than the Whites who wanted to bring back the monarchy. And even within the Whites who wanted to bring back the monarchy, there was differences because now that the Tsar and his family had been murdered, then if you brought back the monarchy, you would need to choose a whole new monarch and a whole new family of monarchs. And there was disagreement, even amongst the monarchists, there was disagreement over who that should be. And in fact, many of the commanders, many of the noble officers who commanded the armies of the Whites envisioned themselves as the new monarchs. That's the problem. You might remember going back into World War I, that in the Russian army, to be an officer, you had to be a noble. And that was true in the White armies. In the White armies, they basically continued the structure of the old Russian army. And so the commanders of the White armies were, for the most part, nobles. Of course, all of them imagined themselves as the new Tsar. So here was the thing. One advantage that you can see immediately for the Reds over the Whites in the Civil War is this. The Reds, the supporters of the Bolsheviks, were all fighting for the same thing. They were fighting to preserve Russia's communist revolution. They were fighting to preserve the Bolsheviks in power. They were fighting to preserve Lenin's dictatorship. The whites were all over the map. Some were fighting to bring back the provisional government, others fighting to bring back the monarchy, and amongst those fighting to bring back the monarchy, they disagreed on who the monarch would be. So even though the whites, as you can see here, sort of, they were attacking the Reds from two different sides. There were two different sets of white armies attacking the sort of Bolshevik heartland around the two big cities, Petrograd and Moscow. So even though the Bolsheviks were forced to fight on two sides, a two-front war, at the same time, they were fighting against an enemy that was disunited over what they were fighting for. So the Russian Civil War was a knockdown, drag-out fight that lasted a little over 2 years. The Red Army had the disadvantage of fighting on two fronts. They had the advantage of at least being in agreement on what they were fighting for. Another major advantage that the Red Army had was its commander, Leon Trotsky. So this is Leon Trotsky addressing his soldiers here. You see his name spelled out here. Trotsky was a brilliant person who was multi-talented. He was a philosopher who really understood the philosophy of communism as well, if not better than V.I. Lenin himself. He was a great public speaker and writer, and he proved to be an extremely competent military commander. Discipline was one of his major goals with the Red Army. He wanted to instill discipline. He wanted to ensure that the uniformity of what they were fighting for was enforced. So he made sure that there were political officers. There were officers in each unit of the Red Army to ensure that all of the soldiers remained on the same page. They were all getting the same message about what they were fighting for. And that was a way of keeping hold of that advantage that the Red Army had. The other thing that Trotsky did was he ordered the construction of a special armored train, which is actually what you see here. This is, I believe, this is either the front or the back of it. And this was Trotsky's armored train, which he could use to shuttle back and forth between the two fronts so that he could command, he could respond immediately to developments on either front by shuttling back and forth between them and getting reports on what was going on. And he could be in personal command on the front in the east in the morning. And by the evening, he could show up on the southern front and get reports and make plans and be in command there as well. So some of the disadvantage of being attacked on two fronts, the inability to coordinate what you're doing, was overcome by Trotsky's sheer energy that he put into fighting this fight and the benefit that he had from his armored train shuttling him back and forth between the fronts. As I mentioned, the war lasted for 2.5 years, and in the end, the Reds defeated the Whites. Trotsky's Red Army defeated all the White armies and brought an end to the Civil War. But it was a brutal and violent civil war in which 15 million Russians died, which is an astonishing number because that was by far more Russians than who had died even fighting the First World War. So remember that the First World War had been a devastating experience for the Russian people. I mean, it had created so much misery that it had essentially caused the Russian Revolution. But only 10 to 12 million Russians died fighting the First World War. 15 million Russians died fighting the Civil War. So the Civil War was another devastating, catastrophic experience for the Russian people. But it put an end to all resistance, all effective resistance to Lenin and the Bolsheviks' rule over Russia. So in between the execution of the Tsar and his family, the Red Terror carried out by Lenin's secret police, the Cheka, and the victory of Trotsky's Red Army during the Russian Civil War, Lenin and the Bolsheviks basically eliminated all internal threats, all internal resistance, all internal opposition to their leadership of Russia. There was one other odd phenomenon that happened during the Russian Civil War, which then spilled over into the years after the Civil War. And that was that many nations that had been part of the Russian Empire during the Russian Civil War broke free and declared their independence. So I'm moving you to the top of page 10, and we need to talk about that just a little bit. So remember that Russia was an empire. So in the centuries prior to the Russian Revolution, Russia had conquered many nations and had incorporated them into their empire. They didn't necessarily love it. A lot of the nations that were incorporated into the Russian Empire didn't necessarily wish to be ruled by Russia, but that's what happens sometimes, right? But then the 19th century had brought this spirit of nationalism, this idea that each nation ought to govern itself and not be ruled by foreigners, by outsiders. Well, the Russian Civil War sort of opened a door for some of these nations that had been forced into the Russian Empire to now declare their independence and become self-governing. The Russians were so busy fighting each other that they couldn't really enforce the control over their empire anymore. In the 19th century, the Poles, for example, people of Poland, they rebelled against Russia twice, but both times the Russians simply sent in the army and crushed them. Now, with the Russians fighting each other in a civil war, nations like the Poles realized this is our chance. This is our chance to become independent. And many, many nations of people who had been conquered by the Russians and forced into their empire now took the opportunity to split off from the Russian Empire and declare their independence. These included the Finns, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Poles, the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, the Georgians, the Armenians, and the Azerbaijanis. See, that's a lot. That's what, 3, 5, 6, 10. 10 different nations. Notice most of them on the western and southern tiers of Russia. 10 different nations now declared themselves independent from the Russian Empire. They're taking advantage of the fact that the Russians were preoccupied fighting each other in the Civil War, taking advantage of that fact to become independent. Now, that was a reality that Lenin simply had to deal with, that nations that had been part of the Russian Empire were peeling off. But once the Civil War wound down, and it was winding down by 1921, Lenin wanted to restore as many of those nations to Soviet or Russian control, Soviet Russian control as possible. And the man who was given the job to try to accomplish that was Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was a pretty ruthless character, as you will learn. But and during the war, he had been the editor of Pravda, the newspaper, Truth. Now he was given the job of Commissar of Nations, which means he was in charge of trying to bring back as many of the nations as possible that had split off from Russia during the Civil War. And what he did is he went into all of those nations. Now, most of them, when they became independent, created representative democracies as their governments. Most of them became what we would today call republics, which means they had representative democracies as their governments. Now, the thing about a representative democracy is if you can form a political party and compete in elections, you have a chance to gain seats in their parliaments and ultimately, through elections, gain some influence over their governments. And that is exactly what Stalin intended. So what Stalin did is, with the support and the finances of the Russian Bolsheviks, Stalin went into all of these different independent democracies, and he helped to establish Bolshevik parties there. And he then encouraged them to compete in the elections and to try to gain seats in the parliaments. Then, once his Bolsheviks gained some seats in the parliament, He then claimed that, or if they didn't gain seats even, he then claimed that they were being suppressed. He claimed that the government was ignoring the Bolsheviks or was suppressing the Bolsheviks, and he called upon the Red Army to assist him. And so through a combination of simply taking advantage of democracy and getting Bolsheviks elected into the governments of these new republics, and then the other part of the combination was military force with the support of the Red Army, Stalin was able to actually have Bolshevik takeovers of 5 out of the 10 nations that had split off from Russia during the Civil War. Those were Byelorussia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. All of those were taken over by the Bolsheviks, again, through a combination of participating in their elections and military force of the support of the Red Army. So in 1922, those 5 states, those 5 republics, voted to rejoin Russia to form something called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And if you want to see that all spelled out, you can see it here in the little reproduced map that I gave you at the bottom of page 10. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, abbreviated USSR, or as I said when I grew up, we simply referred to it as the Soviet Union. So let's break down the phrase Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So first of all, it was a union. In other words, at least officially, it was a union of independent states that had chosen to join each other. All right? Byelorussia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia were each independent states that had chosen to join each other to form a union. What kind of states were these? Well, they were republics. That is to say, they had republican forms of government, people's government, democratic government. This, of course, was a lie, right? Russia did not have a democratic form of government. We've been through that. In Russia, all parties except for the Bolshevik Party were abolished. There were no opposition parties allowed. You can't have a real democracy when you only have one political party and all other ones are prohibited. And of course, once the Bolsheviks took over in Byelorussia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, the Bolshevik Party was declared to be the only legal political party in those countries as well. So even though they referred to themselves as republics and they continued to have elections, they really weren't. They were really all part of one centrally directed dictatorship under the control of Russia, under the control, at least for the moment, of V.I. Lenin. So it was a union of republics. What kind of republics? Socialist republics. Socialist republics. Socialism at that time was used interchangeably with the word communism. What kind of socialist republics? Soviet socialist republics, meaning republics that were communist and ruled by the representatives of the workers, soldiers, and peasants, as represented in the symbol of the Soviet system, right? The hammer, the sword, the hammer, the sickle, and the star. So the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a union of 6 so-called republics which practiced communism and which claimed that their governments acted in the interests of the workers, soldiers, and peasants. USSR, or simply the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union existed from 1922, when it was founded, until 1991, when it disintegrated. So, from here on out, I will usually refer to this as the Soviet Union. And for you guys, you just need to remember that the Soviet Union is not just Russia, but actually Russia plus 6 other nations, which in 1922 joined Russia to form the Soviet Union. And in the following years, additional nations would join the Soviet Union as well. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, all of them would join the Soviet Union in the long run as well. So I will, generally speaking, not say Russia anymore until after we've studied the year 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart. So when you hear Soviet Union from here on out, think of Russia and the other nations which joined with Russia to form the Soviet Union, this communist dictatorship. Now I want to move on to section 6. And once again, we're probably going to look at just a part of section 6, and we'll split up section 6 over 2 lessons. We haven't talked a lot about communism yet. And we talked about the fact that the Bolsheviks were communists, but that in the implementation, they actually acted more like totalitarians. We haven't really talked, though, about how they implemented the communist side of that. And that's what this section's all about. So we're going to start with this. I'm going to have you be able to explain why Lenin's attempt to implement communism failed and why his revised attempt succeeded. Lenin's initial attempt to implement communism he called war communism, and it led to a terrible famine, which is known in Russian history or Soviet history as Lenin's famine. Finally, he attempted a second implementation of communism with a bit of a twist, which he called his new economic policy. And this version of his communism was much more successful. And it was already turning around the economy of the Soviet Union before Lenin died in 1924. So let's go to the top of page 11 and talk a little bit about how Lenin implemented communism. So remember that in communism, the government takes control of all of the means of production or instruments of production. So the government takes control of all the farms, all the factories, all the railroads, all the banks, all of the power plants, anything that is involved in production, whether we're talking about producing food or manufactured goods or power or even producing transportation. Anything that is involved with production is taken over by the government and owned and operated by the government. And the purpose is to achieve equality. The purpose is to eliminate social classes and achieve equality within society. Lenin implemented communism while the Russian Civil War. Lenin chose to try to implement communism while the Russian Civil War was still going on. This was a sort of a, it was like jumping into cold water, okay? When Karl Marx wrote about the communist revolution, he talked about how a society had to go through a sort of an evolutionary process, that eventually societies would evolve toward communism. He said it was historically inevitable, it was bound to happen, but that it was still an evolutionary process. You know, a society would begin as a feudal society, and then it would evolve into a more of a modern manufacturing-based society with a bourgeoisie and a proletariat, class of factory workers. And then you'd have your communist revolution. What Lenin was trying to do was skip over one of those phases, because honestly, Russia, was not a modern society. Its economy was still agriculturally based. It was still a farming-based economy. Yes, there were some factories. Yes, there was a small amount of proletariat, industrial factory workers in the big cities. But overall, Russian society was still feudal, more like a medieval society than a modern one. And so Lenin was essentially saying, we're going to speed up history. We're not going to wait for Russia to evolve into a modern industrial manufacturing-based society and then go communist. We're going to make the communist revolution happen now. So we're going to jump from feudalism right to communism. We're going to skip that capitalist manufacturing phase. We're going to go from feudalism to communism. So it's like, boom, an immediate implementation of communism. And he justified this by arguing that it was necessary because of the war, that the Russian Civil War had created conditions that made an immediate and total adoption of communism necessary, which is why he called it war communism. But it was essentially it essentially did what communism is supposed to do. He took all of the land, so all of the land that had been owned by the nobles was now taken by the government, and all of the factories that were owned by the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, were taken by the government, and the railroads, to the extent that Soviet Russia had them, were taken by the government. And the government now owned and operated all of these things. And what it did was it made sure that whatever was produced in the farms, whatever was produced in the factories, the few factories that they had, was then distributed to the Russian people on an equal basis. So, let's say you're a peasant and you're working on one of the farms that is owned and operated by the government. You do your work in the fields, right? You farm the fields, you produce crops, you harvest those crops. And what happens then is the government comes and they take all those crops. So all the crops that are harvested are taken by the government. And then the government takes, if you can almost imagine all the grain in Russia being harvested and then taken by the government and put into one big bowl. And then the government would take and they would portion it out equally to all the Russian people so that each of the Russian people would get their equal share of the grain. Well, it sounds that's how communism is supposed to work. Each person is supposed to work their very hardest to produce as much as possible, but then the government will take the product and parcel it out to every person equally. Every person gets their equal share, their fair share. Well, again, it sounds very nice. The problem with that is that no matter how hard you worked, you still received your equal share of the product. Let's say grain, for example, to make bread. So it didn't take long for Russian peasants to figure out that no matter how hard they worked, although they were certainly being rallied to work as hard as they could and produce as much grain as they could, and yet no matter how hard you worked, you still received that same equal share of the grain. And this is a problem with communism. It's a problem wherever communism has been implemented. No matter how hard you work, you still receive your equal share of the grain. And the problem with that is it really disincentivized. It took the incentive away from hard work. Because if you worked very, very hard and you were very efficient and very productive and you produced a lot of grain, you only received this equal share. And then on the other hand, if you worked barely at all and you were just sort of doing the bare minimum, you also received that same equal share of grain. So it really disincentivized hard work because you got the same share of grain no matter whether you worked hard or barely worked at all. And, not surprisingly, people being people, when they understood this, they stopped working so hard. So many of the peasants realized they were going to receive that same equal share no matter whether they worked hard or not. Can you imagine if I simply announced that no matter what you do in this class, everybody's going to get a C? Like, what would happen if you were guaranteed a C in this class, no matter what happened? If you got a C, what would you do? Well, the people who were working really, really hard probably wouldn't anymore, because no matter how hard they worked, they'd still get a C. And the people who really weren't working that hard would have no incentive to work harder because they were now going to be given a C, And that's the same thing that happened in Russia when Lenin tried to implement war communism. People simply stopped working. And that, of course, had devastating consequences because when all of these peasants now essentially cut way back on how hard they were working to produce grain, because no matter how hard they worked, they always got the same amount, then what happened is the production of grain in Russia, in Soviet Russia, collapsed. And that led to a famine. And, it was a famine that affected people all across Russia. And as a matter of fact, approximately 10 million Russians died as a result of starvation or malnutrition, either starving to death or dying of other diseases that impacted them more because they didn't have enough food. 10 million people died. By the way, if you start adding these numbers up, 10 million killed fighting World War I, 15 million killed during the Civil War, 10 million more from what was called Lenin's famine. We're talking about 35 million Russians or more who died in a period of really about 10 years. But Lenin's famine was catastrophic and devastating for the Russian people. And it was clearly caused by this shift from a feudal economy to communism. And it was clearly caused by the fact that under communism, there was no incentive to keep producing at a high level. Lenin understood. He got that this was the problem. And so in 1922-23, he announced a new economic policy, which he called the New Economic Policy, the NEP. And what Lenin said is this: okay, from now on, I'm going to give a quota to each peasant. You must produce this much amount of grain, okay? And this much amount of grain is what the government is going to come and take from you. If, however, you produce more than that amount of grain, we won't take the additional grain. If you produce above and beyond your quota, you may keep that grain. And you can either use that to give your family more to eat, or you can sell it to make a little extra money for yourself. But whatever amount of grain that you produce above and beyond the quota, above and beyond what the government's going to collect from you, you get to keep. Whereas, remember, under war communism, the government took it all, right? Now Lenin set a quota for each individual and said, you must produce this much grain, but if you produce anything above and beyond that, you may keep it for yourself. Similarly, he said to Russian people, the government is going to own all the factories, but if you have a personal skill that you want to use to produce things just out of your home, if you want to have a small business, let's say you're really good at sewing, and so you want to make clothes and sell them to your neighbors, or you want to produce shoes in your garage and sell them to your friends or your neighbors, or you want to bake cookies and sell them to the people in the neighborhood, whatever. If you want to have a small business that you operate out of your home, we'll let you do it. You may do that. The government will continue to own and operate the farms and the factories, but whereas under true communism, no individual is allowed to have their own business, under the new economic policy, we're going to allow you to have your own small business. In other words, Lenin was making somewhat significant departures from true communism. Because remember that in true communism, the government allows you to make no choices, no decisions about economics yourself. Here, the government was now allowing some freedom of choice. A worker could choose, if they wanted to produce more grain than what the government required, or a worker could choose not to. If a worker chose to produce more, they could choose whether to sell that grain or keep it for their family. So Lenin's new economic policy was a departure from true communism in that it introduced a certain amount of choice into the economy, the Soviet economy. Also, by allowing individuals to have their own small businesses operating out of their houses, it was a departure from true communism in that some businesses, some economic activity, some production was now no longer being controlled by the government. Some production was being controlled by individuals, and individuals would make a little money for themselves. They could make a private income by baking cookies or selling shoes or something out of their house. So in two rather significant ways, Lenin's new economic policy departed from true communism. And then in a third way, because in true communism, the goal is absolute equality. That's why they were distributing grain to everybody equally. But under the new economic policy, it opened the door for some inequality in Russia. Because if one individual chose to produce more grain than required, then that individual would have, if he sold it, would then have a little extra money for the family. That family would have a little extra money. Or if another family was baking cookies or making shoes and selling them out of their house, they would have a little extra money. So Lenin's new economic policy also allowed for a little bit of inequality in Soviet society. So in all those ways, it was a departure from true, pure communism. But it worked. It worked. As a matter of fact, by 1924, which is the year that Lenin died, the Soviet grain production had rebounded completely from Lenin's famine. During Lenin's famine, Soviet grain production had collapsed, but now, due to the new economic policy and due to giving the people some incentive to produce, saying, hey, if you produce more, you can keep it, that grain production didn't just rebound. It rebounded back to where it was before the famine. And in fact, it kept growing, and it rebounded back to even more than was being produced before World War I began. So, of course, prior to World War I, Russia was producing a lot of grain. The war, by taking so many of the peasants out of the fields and putting them into the army, had caused grain production to decline. It had flattened out a little bit, had then collapsed because of Lenin's implementation of communism. Now, with the new economic policy, that grain production rebounded all the way back up to where it was before the war started, and even exceeded that. So simply by making a few modifications, a few revisions, and backing off a little bit on true, pure communism, Lenin found a way to revive the Russian economy and revive production. And then he died. Lenin suffered from a couple of pretty significant strokes. The first one, I think, was in 1922, and it rendered him, it paralyzed him and made it almost impossible for him to speak. And then the last of these strokes in 1924 killed him. And succeeding him was Joseph Stalin. And so the next lesson will focus on Joseph Stalin and his plans for the Soviet Union. And that will be our last lesson on Russia and the Soviet Union in this unit. And we'll move on to Benito Mussolini and Italy. So we'll talk Stalin in our next lesson. And I hope that until that time, you're able to stay healthy and stay safe. And we'll teach you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody.